You're listening to the Hella Well with Danielle show, a podcast taking women of color on a journey exploring all things wellness and travel related. We're all about showing you how to put on your oxygen mask first and creating lasting self-care habits that will free you to travel the world and live the life you truly desire, and not one you have to fake loving. I'm your host, Danielle Washington. Now let's buckle up and start this journey. Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the Hella Well with Danielle podcast. I am your host, Danielle Washington, and today is our fourth episode in the month-long series that is called Awaken to You. And in this month-long series, in the month of December, we are focusing everything on being intentional about reflecting on just this year or just our life in general, so we can be awake to where we are now and where we want to be, so we can truly thrive in 2021. And in this episode, we're talking everything about grief. And before you start thinking, well, I didn't have anyone die on me, so I'm good. Grief is so much more than just death. I mean, grief shows up in so many different ways. Like for me, I just think that, all the things that all of us, whether we recognize or not, we're grieving the plans we have for 2020. We're grieving Sunday brunches. We're grieving holiday traditions, getting together for Thanksgiving and Christmas. We're grieving, going to concerts, seeing our friends, being able to have dinner, in a restaurant, especially here in California where we're back on shutdown. And so there's so many different ways that we are grieving. And what I love about our podcast guest today, Herdyne Mercier, talks about it. The way she explains grief is whenever you are experiencing a heartbreak. Again, grief is whenever you are experiencing a heartbreak, and we're all experiencing some form of a heartbreak in one form or another. So grief is normal. We're all grievers, and grieving is normal. What is not normal, and I love that she says this, is teaching us from childhood about the power of our tears. There is so much power in being able to release and express our emotions. And I just want to make sure that we're getting these feelings out and, acknowledging it, because you can't grieve and change and move forward when you aren't accepting, acknowledging, recognizing, seeing where you are and where you're having a heartbreak. So my guest, Herdyne Mercier, is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a certified grief coach. She's also the host of the most amazing Redefining Grief Podcast. She's a retreat facilitator and a transformational speaker. Her calling in life is really to create non-judgmental spaces for broken hearts to heal and purposely move into a living, restored life. And after this year, we've had, this year has been just a year, but not really. After this year, we've had, a time, we need a time to heal our hearts so we can truly restore the lives that we have and live purposely in 2021. So get your pen and papers together and know this episode is for you, and it's time for you to go deeper. And if you're ready to go further deeper after hearing this podcast, I encourage you to make sure to sign up for our 5-day challenge, which will be happening the second week in January. We actually moved it to the second week in January. It's called Breaking Up with the Norm. And that is a time frame where we're really going to, beginning of the year, dive fully deep, hard in, and making sure you are setting up yourself to truly thrive in 2021. But for now, let's get ready for this podcast. And get ready for some gems. Thanks. Hey there, Herdyne. Thank you again for being on the Hella Well with Danielle podcast. How are you doing today?
I am amazing. Thank you so much for having me on. I look forward to this dialogue and just an honest chat about what we're going to be discussing today, all things grief.
Girl, this topic literally is so near and dear to me because it literally is what got me to start my business. Like grief for me. And I know we never really talked about this. I had a period of grief where I didn't realize I was grieving. I had, 3 friends pretty much say exactly the same thing that don't know each other, that I was grieving. And I'm like, are you crazy? I'm not grieving. And, when the third one said it was someone who I trusted so much, it was like, oh, maybe I kind of need to listen to this situation. And so, with this year being what it was, 2020 being a year, let's call it just a year, I feel like most people hear the word grief and they think, oh my God, I didn't have anyone die. I didn't, lose anything major in life. So I'm not grieving. And I know that there's different stages of grief. Like, can you talk a little bit more about grief is just more than just someone passing on?
Grief is, I think the number one thing that I want to say is that grief is not, there's no stages to grief. I know there's this myth that there's these 5 stages, and Dr. Ross did create stages of grief. We've heard about it. We've heard about it in school, but she really created those stages of grief for someone who is finding out that they're on their deathbed. And that's the process that they go through.
Ooh.
And so when you're grieving and you go through these things, well, I'm not angry right now, and you're talking about the many different stages, it leaves you wondering, there's just something not right about these stages. They're not right because it's not fit for that situation. I think the very first thing that I want to tell everyone is that we are all grievers, and grieving is normal.
Oh, I love that.
And what is not normal, not teaching us from childhood the power of our tears.
Can you explain more about that, the power of our tears? Because I think people are like, I'm with her, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's power in that release. There's power in being upset about whatever you're grieving about. And I like to think about grief as grief is not just the death of someone. Grief is whenever you experience a heartbreak. And we are all going to experience heartbreaks in our lives. So that makes grief normal. One of the things that I like to say is that God created duck tears for us for a reason. So He wanted us to show emotions. However, we have never been taught to properly grieve. So grieving feels not normal. It feels foreign. And so we reject grief versus embracing grief. Because the moment you begin to embrace grief, you can get to what I call my 5th stage is restoration.
And that's so true. Like, I'm a strong believer. If you name it, you can feel it, and then you can actually start dealing and working through it. But sometimes you get to the place where you can't name it because you aren't recognizing it. And that was my case, where I didn't recognize that I was in grief. I didn't see it because again, when you're talking about the 5 stages, I'm like, I didn't have all these different things. And in that situation, it was talking about, me losing 6 people. But I even think in 2020, where we are, I don't know why I had to think about what year it was, because I'm trying to forget some days. I had to recognize that I'm grieving my business. Like, I had all these plans in 2020. 2020 was going to be my year. Like, I'm typically not that person who says, oh, 2020 is going to be my year. But I had literally legit, it was like, I had a game plan. I had my ducks in the row. I was changing some things with my travel business, Rogue Experiences. And, this whole, Hello Well with Danielle didn't even exist. I had a whole other trajectory. And then COVID happened. And, when 99.9% of your income comes from travel, and travel closes, that changes everything. And I had to grieve not only just my business, but also my life. Like, I'm usually gone. Like last year, I was counting. I went to 12 countries last year, and I was like, I went nowhere. And I'm like, and this year, I'm like, no, I really went nowhere.
And what we're grieving is that normalcy. Everything that you just talked about, you are grieving your schedule. You are grieving the things that defined who you are, whether that's being a traveler, speaking to people, meeting new people, the excitements of getting on a flight. We are grieving those things. And to your listeners, right? You're probably grieving your career. You thought you were in a position where you will always have a job. COVID hits and they're letting people go. Listen, they are letting people go in Disneyland. Hello.
It's real when Disneyland's like, you're out.
Okay.
The happiest place in the world.
I know, in Disneyland. And so many things are happening. You may find out that now you have to spend more time with your spouse, and you're learning some things about spending some time with your spouse that, do I really want to be in this relationship? And so now you're grieving this relationship in the relationship you thought you had with that individual.
Yeah, I'm seeing that with so many of my friends, even not just their spouse, but even with their kids, and they're like having to actually be with them more long. I mean, it sounds, sad, but it's an issue, and they're grieving not having their alone time.
You may be even grieving your title because you allowed your title, your position, that parking spot to define who you are. And now you no longer get to go to that parking spot, And so you have to sit in that.
And I love that you're saying to sit in that, because I'm a strong believer in being still. And I remember when I always tell people I ghosted people to get to my healing. So I literally packed up when the third friend said I was grieving. And I went to Bali, and I had this game plan as I'm going to type A Virgo style. I'm a Virgo. I'm going to Virgo style my, grief. And so I grabbed my Michelle Obama Becoming book. I grabbed my journal. I went to this gorgeous resort in the middle of nowhere. And I'm like, okay, I have 2.5 days to grieve, and then I'm going to go hang out on the beach. And that so did not work out in my favor, because every time I tried to do it that way, I would get like this headache where I couldn't function. And so I would just have to be still. But it was in that stillness that I started to heal. But I didn't know that at the time.
I think what people don't realize is that you have to think for a moment that you have bottled up all these emotions. However you were taught. If you were a little young girl that was taught you do not cry in front of anybody. You go to your room, you keep it to yourself. So when someone asks you how you're doing, you're taught, you have been programmed. You really never tell them the truth. And it's your friends who know who you are, like your friend who looks you in the eye and says something isn't right. And they keep telling you it in as loving as they can until you wake up and say, something isn't right. And then you begin that journey of what my number one anchor is truth.
Yeah.
Telling the truth about your heartache. Like you said, you got the headache, it was emotional. Oftentimes when you first let it out, you have a whole physical body reaction to this release. It's like you have been like in a bottle, tightly sealed this entire time. And so it's that release that is the most scariest. And like what I want to tell individuals, if we anchor down in our truth, however ugly it may be, freedom comes. Freedom.
And how do we anchor down? Because, one thing I think a lot of my people, my listeners, would deem themselves as, the strong woman or strong Black woman. And it's like, they're the strong friend. So like, as the strong friend, they're thinking like, well, how do I don't have time because I'm so busy helping and, literally trying to save everyone else, that they're like, well, I don't have time to grieve. I don't have time to, sit in my truth. Like, what would you say to them?
That I don't have time is not the truth.
Yeah.
Once you make yourself the priority, if you do not make time for the one life you get, every time I've been to a funeral in my life and they went 6 feet under, I have yet to see them again. You don't get a second chance at life coming back in this form. So if you don't make time for you, when it's time to say goodbye, it's over. There's no reset button. And so I think that is a myth. I think that is false. I think when we decide, like you decided, I am going to release this bottle of healing. And it looked like a trip in the beginning, but that was your place of how you escaped. In everyone else, it may look different. But it's that truth, sitting in that truth. And I think every good girlfriend should be connected to a therapist, not just a friend.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes. Yes.
I think that therapist allows you that space and that freedom to really let it out without judgment. And without any fear that your business going to be out in the street.
People they worry about that, but I think there's so many other benefits behind therapy that I encourage people, if you don't have a therapist, especially right now, with racial tensions, COVID, everything, now is definitely the time. And you talk about truth and, getting to it. So what if someone's ready? Okay, I'm ready to figure out what my truth is. What's the first step that they should take?
Examining their heart. That's the second anchor.
Nice.
Really examine your heart. And what we do sometimes as human beings, without even noticing it, we become this machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we hide our brokenness behind titles. We hide our brokenness by doing more. We hide our brokenness by putting on the title of mother. But in the shower, you're sad, you're miserable, you feel alone, you feel lost. We hide our brokenness by becoming a wife. We hide our sadness because we're putting all the responsibility of filling in the cracks with a title. And what we learn is that every crack cannot be filled with a title. The only time you can glue these cracks together is by anchoring down in the truth of your heartbreak, examining the heart and finding out what's really going on. And during that exploration of whatever it is you're having that soul moment when you begin to be truthful about your heartache, not feelings, heartache. And then number 3 is my third anchor that I like to teach is, who are we connecting it? Because there is power in community, but in the right community who sees you, who hears you, and validates you without judgment.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times we don't think about our community. And I always tell people, especially my clients, is that you have to have a squad. And on your squad, like my therapist is on my squad. And, I love my friends. My friends are great, but I love having someone who is trained. I have a therapist. I have a life coach. I have different people, and I've had to say goodbye to people who I love dearly, but I did know that we were not on the same path, where I was on a path of changing in my lifestyle. And there's certain people who are going to see you as, oh, you're always that girl who, just did travel. Who do you think you are, and these different things. And so if someone can't validate and accept who you are becoming and who you're opening and changing to and redefining to, you got to sometimes let those people go. And there's, grief in that lost as well.
Oftentimes I think the biggest thing that I find to be so powerful, and it's these 2 words, goodbye. And oftentimes people think it's a diss. No, goodbye. If you are taught how to say healthy goodbyes, when you see somebody in the grocery store, you won't put your head down. You would greet them and keep it moving.
Okay, so we need to know, how do you say healthy goodbyes? Not the shady ones.
No, not the shady ones. The healthy goodbye is saying, I am releasing for my benefit. Healthy goodbyes. And how do you say healthy goodbyes? You tell the truth about that relationship. You have to examine your heart about that relationship with that individual, and the connection. Was there a connection? I think when you're telling the truth about your experience, not their experience, you can have lunch and say goodbye. Like, and it's not an ambush goodbye. It is literally having an adult conversation and just say, I realize after all these years, you're not serving the way I would love to be served. You're not meeting my friends' goals. What are we actually doing? Let's talk about it. And if this is working for us, great. If it's not working for us, things are going to be limited, but I at least want to say goodbye. I always remind people, we have funeral service, not for the dead, but for the living. It is us having closure with that relationship. And if you've ever attended a funeral service, you'll find that some people have closures with the individual that passed away, and some of them are filled with grief because they know there was things that they never discussed. There was things that they never hashed out. There was things that they never processed, and they thought they had forever.
Yeah. And the thing is with that, when saying goodbye, and taking another step, it doesn't have to be someone who's alive. You can still say goodbye to someone and write a letter that someone that is not, living anymore, or someone that you're just not in contact with, but it's a way to formally say goodbye for you. It's not for other people. It's for you, and it's for your healing.
It's your closure, and it's your journey, and it's your experience of really loving on you enough to close the chapter.
Yeah. And, I see a lot of people talking or not talking about, but just feeling uncomfortable about that.
Mhm.
They feel the guilt. And I think, people feel guilt in their grief. Like, they're judging their feelings. Like, how do you help people handle that guilt that they feel in having those feelings about, the loss or trying to go through grief?
I think it's really not, I think people really need to understand the power of understanding grief, the
Hmm.
knowledge of grief. Because I think the knowledge of grief in that process is really what is freeing. It is the unknown of grief that keeps people guilty
Yeah.
because they're thinking, am I doing something wrong? First, I want to set everyone free that everybody's grief journey is going to look different.
Hmm.
Your grief journey is going to be just like your DNA, unique to you. And the goal is not me looking at Danielle and saying, but she's crying. She's not crying, My goal is not to compare my grief to you. The goal should be for me to understand my own grief process. Am I an individual during hard times? Am I that individual that barricades myself in work? So I don't have to deal with the reality that I'm going through a divorce. He's broken my heart. I'm devastated. Am I
So how
that?
do you know your own grief process?
I think your own grief process is by asking the questions.
Yeah.
What do I typically do when I get bad news? Am I that individual that likes to take charge so that I don't have to deal with the reality of what's really happening? I'm going to bury my husband tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think journaling is great for that. I think, and that's one of the, that was like, that's why the first part of this series of the Awaken to You, this
Mhm.
monthly series we're doing in the month of December, journaling was the first one because you need to start asking yourself some questions and start getting awakening to, where you are and what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. I feel like, one particular troubling aspect I've seen throughout the pandemic and just in people I've been talking to is this open-endedness that, there's no end. So they have this grief and they have this loss, but they're not sure when it's going to end. Like what do you tell people when they feel like they don't see an end?
I think what happens is, I think what people don't realize is that the grief process is a lifelong process.
Ooh, I
And,
didn't see that
and
coming.
yeah, the grief process is a lifelong journey. It's not it's a marathon versus a race. So if I had a miscarriage, right?
Hmm.
And now when I got pregnant, all I dreamed of was walking my daughter down the aisle and seeing her graduate college, and all these things that we put in our mind. Once we know the sex of the baby, we really plan their life out. And then you don't make it to the delivery room, right? And you could be fine 10 years later. But remember that dream of walking that child down the aisle? Now, what I want you to realize is, now let's say it's 25 years later, right? You really haven't dealt with it. You really haven't talked about it. Now you're attending a wedding and you calculate the age of the bride and you think of, this could have been my daughter. Grief will overflow you. I think we try to like, oh, I'm good now. It's 25 years. No, remember, I said it, that we need to learn how to embrace heartache sometimes and understanding how we process it, because it affects everybody so differently and it's so uniquely to you. The moment you understand your grief dance, that entanglement of it all, the moment you'll be able to identify what your journey needs to look like.
And I think you make such a great point because, there's people who are grieving this year, their dating life,
Mhm.
dating as they knew it, is not the same. It's been on hold. They're, grieving their social life that they had, their business, but then they're, online and comparing and seeing other people finding ways to pivot in different ways and they're not doing it. And they're getting more into a depression of like, well, it is what it is, and not, getting to the truth and getting to their own heartache and recognizing it. Instead, they're just in this world of comparing. And I think being on social media, we do that. I mean, being on Facebook and all these other things, it's so easy to do that.
It is very, very easy to do that. And I think that would be the number one mistake that individuals make is the spirit of comparing. Like, I'm going to compare. And we don't even realize every time you scroll, you are giving them credit of what they're showing you on social media and depleting from you.
So how do we get past that?
I think we get past it by sometimes it's very hard to do is unplugging.
Oh, I love unplugging. I'm all for it.
Unplugging and reconnecting for that season. Because I think sometimes we get into our old habits of how we reconnect with ourselves, and every season is going to look different. We grieve for different reasons. It could be the same situation, but every season could look differently. There are individuals who've been planning their wedding forever, right?
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are planning, like, especially in my Rogue Experiences group, a lot of people who were planning, their 30th, their 40th, their 50th birthday travel experience, and they're grieving that celebration.
Yes,
And it's not like you can't have a celebration. It's shifting what that looks like.
Yep.
But if you're in that mindset where woe is me and you can't get out of that and recognize your truth as you talk about and get into that heartache, you're going to stay in that space where I feel like that's the main reason, especially why I wanted you on here, because I don't want to see people stay in that space. I want to see them recognize it and be able to name it, and move through it. Name it, feel it, and move through it.
You got it. Name it, feel it, and move through it. But move through it in truth.
Yeah.
You have to move through it in truth. And sometimes that truth doesn't look good.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's and even when I talk to people often about that in terms of your comfort zone, when you're moving out of something, people, when you're doing personal growth, there's moments where, let's be real, it don't look good and it sure the heck don't feel good. But what the other side of that mountain looks like and feels like is heaven. But you have to sometimes go through a period of what I call the yuckiness to get to that side. And it's that part of, understanding the truth and working through that heartache to get to the happiness. But a lot of people are like, well, they stop there because they're like, it's too hard.
I think oftentimes people don't want to deal with the ugliness of the emotions, right? And so we've learned to run away if it's not beautiful. I think they're what we call filtered out grief. They've filtered their emotions so much that they can't even identify what grief is. That wall is so thick that it's scary.
Yeah. So what if someone's hearing this and it's triggering them to some degree? They're thinking, that sounds like potentially me. What do they do? How do they get past the filter?
I think you get past the filter if you feel like you can't do it on your own versus journaling, learning to really tap in. Do the homework of connecting with an individual who specializes in grief. I mean, oftentimes, if you're going into surgery and you need knee surgery, are you going to trust a heart surgeon to do the knee surgery who has no experience? Or are you going to go to someone that has knee surgery experience? And so you really want to go in. This is my niche. This is my baby. I've spent countless hours understanding grief. So I make that treatment process for individuals and recognizing it a lot shorter.
So how can people connect with you on a deeper level who are ready, especially as they go from 2020 and just surviving? Because so many of us are just in that survival mode and start thriving in 2021 and really tapping into their truth, their heartache, and being able to reconnect with themselves.
I think the very first places that they can go is HerdyneMercier.com, HerdyneMercier.com. The second place is really tapping into my social media, Herdyne Mercier on all platforms, as well as I would say my podcast. My podcast really goes into heartaches of what this person has went through, whether it was a divorce, financial issues, and showing you how grief showed up in your life and what their process was to getting on the other side of the mountain that you talk about.
I love it. I'll definitely make sure that we have all those links in the show notes. And I so appreciate you being here on the show. We just, again, this is the time of the year where we're already reflecting and thinking about what we want in life. And, if you are ready to start making that jump into breaking some of these norms, and I encourage you to also join our challenge we're doing called Breaking the Norm. It starts January 4th. It's really going to be specializing in breaking up with these habits, getting to your truth, and start interrupting and making new habits and routines in your life. So, yeah. So at the end of every show, I always love to do some quick fire questions.
Mm-hmm.
They're just 4 questions, nothing major. And so whatever comes to mind, just answer whatever you feel like you hear come from your heart. So the first one is, how do you define living hella well?
Hella well. Truth.
Love it. Aisle or window?
Window.
What is always in your travel bag?
What is always in my travel bag? I'm going to say my contacts.
That's an important one.
I need to be able to see.
That's an important one. I have forgotten my contacts and low-key had to wear my glasses. I'm like, I don't wear my glasses at all unless something's wrong with my eyes. If you see me in glasses, know something's wrong with my eyes, because that's the only reason why you'll ever see me in glasses.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last question is, if you were going to give advice to your younger self about, this importance of this wellness revolution and our self-care not being a luxury and the need for it now, what would you tell your younger self?
Reset. Press the reset and move forward. And reset to your standard, not to anybody else's.
I love that. Reset to your standards and no one else's. Thank you so much, Herdyne, for being on here. You are a gift to so many.
Thank you.
I mean, I wish I knew you when I was going through my issues, because I had no clue. I was like, I'm fine, girl, fine. Y'all wrong. So thank you. I think this will help so many people out there, especially this year, who are grieving 2020.
I know.
And are ready to, move forward and thrive. All right. Thank you guys again for joining us for another episode of the Hella Well with Danielle podcast. And I look forward to talking to you guys next week. See you then. Ciao. Thanks for joining us this week on the Hella Well with Danielle show. Make sure to visit our website, hellawellwithdanielle.com, where you can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Spotify, and Amazon Music and never miss an episode. Also, you can follow us on social media at Hella Well with Danielle on Facebook and Instagram, and Hella Well Danny on Twitter. And if you hella love the show and got some good nuggets out of it, know that I'm not too proud to ask for you to please leave a rating or review on iTunes so that we can continue to expand our reach and help other women of color. Again, thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you next week. Ciao.